Hi, everyone. It's Alicia and Marcy here. We have a special guest today on the Exclusion Podcast, Rebecca Foshole-Luke from Positive Choices Counseling.
Hello.
So thank you for joining us to discuss the important work of Positive Choices Counseling and tools to help you cope while working from home with children. And we'll once again be recording in dual mediums. So this discussion can be found in both the Exclusion Podcast format and through our YouTube channel. And we'll post a link in the resource notes and on social media for you to be able to find both recordings. And we have recorded this episode on June 3rd. We had been planning on recording this episode for a while, and then the world's completely changed. So we will also be kind of threading in and discussing Black Lives Matter and the importance of anti-racist allyship.
And as always, in the spirit of respect, reciprocity, and truth, we acknowledge that the podcast is being recorded on the traditional territories and oral practices of Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta and Region 3 Métis Nation. We acknowledge all nations, Indigenous and non, who live, work, and play in these lands, and to all those who assist in their stewardship for generations to come.
So before we get started with our interview and introduce our incredible guest, we wanted to first and foremost acknowledge our current world and the importance of advancing the Black Lives Matter movement. So we have all seen the multitude of examples of systemic racism in the U.S. With recent murders of Black men by police. And we've witnessed, the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Ahmaud Arbery, just to name a couple. And it's a very common reaction to think that, it's better in Canada, it's less severe in Canada. It's not very common here, but in reality, that is far from the truth. There's been murders of Dondre Campbell and Regis Korchinski-Paquette, most recently by police in Canada. People of color and Black people and Indigenous people still experience racism daily. It can be overt through public acts of violence, but it can also be really subtle, like implicit biases and subtle microaggressions. And it's important that to know that this sort of systemic racism has been embedded in our institutions and government, law, education, even the child welfare system and the child advocacy system, which we'll be talking about with our guest today. So just before we get started, Alicia and I just wanted to reiterate that Black Lives Matter, period. And we all need to commit to continuous learning and to accelerate our journeys to becoming an active anti-racist ally. So I hope you will join Alicia and I on that journey. So we're really excited about our guest today and to learn from her. And here's a bit of her background. So our guest, Rebecca Foshole-Luke, is a registered social worker and the Child Welfare Advocacy Program Manager at Positive Choices Counseling. She holds a BA in Sociology and Women's Studies from Mount Royal University and is a recent graduate of Dalhousie University for her Bachelor's of Social Work. Rebecca stays up to date on the latest child welfare research, attends training and workshops to enhance her skills, and she's an active member and part of the editorial team for the National Institute of Forensic Social Work. Rebecca loves to give back and volunteers her time and experience. She's currently part of the Black Youth Project Steering Committee, which is a new youth initiative project through Action Dignity Calgary. She's also part of the Safe at Home Working Group, which is a pilot project through Rowan House that aims to look at alternative ways to address domestic violence by removing the abuser from the home. Rebecca uses her life experiences, education, and passion for social justice to inform the work she does with families. She aims to use her privilege and position to advocate for and empower her clients. So through her work, she hopes to influence policy and organizational changes that will ensure parents and children have access to equitable resources so they stand the best possible chance of being a healthy family unit. So thank you so much, Rebecca.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on here.
So first off, tell us a little bit about the type of work that you do at Positive Choices Counseling and maybe a little bit about the journey you've had up until now within your working profession.
Let's see how I can not make this a long spiel, but I started at Positive Choices last year in January, actually, as a practicum student. And then I officially started working there in July. So, we, work with families that are navigating the family law and child welfare system. So we do parenting coordination, supervised visitation and parenting programs, and as well as child welfare advocacy. Our work is really, grounded, as mentioned, in my bio, in ensuring, parents and guardians have, access to equitable resources and advocacy and support as they navigate this system, so that they're able to have, those healthy homes and keep their children, with them as well too, because we know that the legal system is challenging to navigate. It's costly. The thought of me having to go have any legal problems and pay $500 an hour without other stressors. So we do find that that when people are going through the legal system and often marginalizes already vulnerable populations. And, that's really one of the reasons how Positive Choices actually started. So, we're a small team. So it's myself, Melanie Carefoot, who's our fearless leader, and Kayan Layler, who does our supervised visitation and parenting program. So Melanie is a clinical social worker. She has her master's in social work, and she worked for Children's Services for many years as a team lead, as well as a manager at Adoption Options. So she retired in 2012. She was fighting the system internally, and she was like, you know what, I can't do this. I'm disturbing the peace too much. So she kind of retired, but a lawyer actually had a complicated child welfare file, so he asked her to consult on it. And so then she opened up her private business and started offering that support. So I know you mentioned forensic social work earlier, and she was already actually practicing forensic social work, even without actually knowing she was doing that. And forensic social work, something I've been practicing as well, is the intersection of social work and the law. So it's anyone that's working in child welfare, family law, corrections, the youth justice system. And really, it's the idea that the lawyers are able to address the legal issues, and as a social worker, then we're able to address those more complicated social issues and use our risk assessment skills to be able to make sure that the client is supported and able to meet whatever requirements to be able to for best outcomes, and really working and understanding the legislation and the law and explaining it in a way that clients are able to understand. So Melanie, that's when she started doing the work. She also mainly does our parenting coordination. Are you guys familiar with what parenting coordination is?
No.
I think we kind of talked about that, Marcy, but basically parenting coordination is an agreement between parents that are, separated, or it's court ordered. So it's a form of alternative dispute resolution for high conflict parents, right? So obviously not all parents that separate, it's positive, right? So Melanie's, being that she's a social worker, she's really able to integrate some of those strength-based, trauma-informed aspects into that work to really help parents communicate better, where children are kept out of the conflict, and it's definitely keeps parents out of the court system. It's more affordable, and it's just better overall for the family to be able to work out some of those agreements without litigating. So she mostly does that, and obviously she continues to mentor and guide us with the child welfare. Like I said, I'm really new to this. And then we have Kayan. She does our supervised visitation. and parenting programs. So when parents are separated and divorced, some of them do require, in order to have access to their kids, it needs to be supervised by an agency, right? And that's where we come in. So we have supervised visitors. We mostly really only employ people with a child and youth background or social work students, because not only are we observing and writing reports that are used in court to help like increase access for parents or not require parents to have that supervised access. There's also the component of parent coaching. So Kian has a child and youth degree out of the University of Victoria. So she really, the way she trains our staff is to understand, the ages and stages, development, and most of the parents actually that are accessing our service needing supervised access are dads, right? And if we're kind of thinking intersectionally and about barriers, dads actually face a lot of challenges navigating like the family law system in terms of getting custody and access to their children. And they experience a different types of domestic violence, right? In terms of, withholding access to kids. So she's able to offer that additional one-on-one support to the dads on, how they can, for example, have a successful visit. So are you bringing, the right toys? You guys are both moms. Are you bringing the right toys? Like if you have a 3-year-old and an 8-year-old, what are you doing during that visit? Because you're going to engage with a 3-year-old differently than you engage with an 8-year-old, right? So kind of really just giving, like, we want parents to succeed at this, right? Even with the parenting coordination, that's the hope. And so it really helps that we have that multidisciplinary approach that, Kiana is not a social worker. So we consult each other on files, right? Just to have that well-rounded approach. Even though I'm a parent, I have a 3-year-old, I'm still learning. I don't know everything about child development, and I have her on speed dial. And she's like, don't use bribes. You can't use bribes with a 3-year-old. I'm like, but it works.
Uh-oh, that's what I do.
And she's like, don't say, that you're a bad girl, right? Just simple things that like, that parenting, like there are a lot of things that we don't know. And that really helps inform some of the child welfare advocacy work that I do in providing those supports to parents. So that's really, I guess like the work that we do. And you had asked a follow-up question. I don't know if you had a question, but
sure.
There was a follow-up question that you had.
That's fine. You've explained how diverse your group is, and I like here on Exclusion, we love to explain how diverse working environments, not just in people's backgrounds, but also experience, education, how it can create a more inclusive working environment and how you can have better outcomes. So I really love the approach that your group is taking to make sure you have different expertise to bring to the table to do what you do.
Yeah.
And with this in mind, what kind of groundwork do you do to help with allyship and recognizing power and privilege dynamics? Can you share a little bit about how you help in that side of things?
So, like I said, when you're talking about like power, dynamics, and allyship, like our work, right, is we're doing critical social justice work. We're constantly trying to challenge these big systems like the child welfare system, the legal system. And, like our values, are, advocacy, right? So being able to use, our expertise to advocate for clients as they're navigating the system, in meetings when, attending children's services meetings, where clients that maybe are on legal aid, taking that extra time, because lawyers on legal aid, they might have a large caseload. And so taking that extra time to really help clients understand what is happening, their rights and responsibility. With the parenting coordination, Melanie, her rates are significantly lower than, the rates of other parenting coordinators, right? So just being able to say, how can we really serve people that need this help, and really focusing as well, another value is education. So really educating the clients on their rights, educating the dads that go through our supervised visitation program, again, giving them those resources so they succeed, right? With the child welfare advocacy, again, educating clients on children's services processes. So sometimes we do like a learning circle to know, okay, why is having supports so important to children's services, right? By giving information and clients having that knowledge, it really empowers them to be able to be more successful and know what is really happening and how to eventually advocate for themselves as well. Our other value is, multidisciplinary approach, right? Because when you're looking at power and critical analysis of the system, you do need multiple perspectives to be able to assess like what is going on. So if you have the child welfare legislation, this is what is in the legislation, but how is that being implemented? So you have, child welfare, the managers, and then there's the actual frontline caseworkers. So how does that trickle down in terms of the legislation and how it impacts clients and how they're being, when children's services intervene, what does that look like? And what are parents experiencing, right? And in all this, a lot of times parents' voices are lost. Often my clients express how, helpless and powerful they feel going through, the child welfare system because it's the government.
Yeah.
They're powerful, right? So
and they don't always consider, the human aspect of things, right? And it's bureaucratic and you're moving papers along this larger system, right? And
yeah, definitely. Like you're saying all the right things, and it's very true. And I think that like there are a lot of stereotypes about who gets involved with children's services, and why. And I know that before I started working at Positive Choices, I also held those same stereotypes. So it's parents that are using drugs, and they don't deserve their kids, they're bad parents. I held those stereotypes. I didn't even know that when children are apprehended, that there's a whole legal process. They have to go to court, they need a lawyer. There's this legislation with different timelines and conditions. And, I think like it's really important that people understand the historical, political, and larger systemic factors that do contribute to certain communities and individuals being more vulnerable to having CS involvement, right? So instead of blaming and saying, okay, they're a bad parent, like look at the full context, that trauma-informed, context. And I think another thing that people don't realize is, when it comes to things like criminal law. So obviously I'm not a lawyer, this is legal information, but again, forensic social work. So in criminal law, right, it's innocent until proven guilty. But when it comes to child welfare, so, there are 4 laws that really govern child intervention in Alberta. But the main one is the Child, Youth, and Family Enhancement Act. And it outlines some of the things it outlines are, what are the causes for intervention, like neglect, physical, sexual abuse, failure to protect, emotional injury, that type of thing. It outlines legislative timelines. So the amount of time that a child is apprehended and in care, 6 months, 12 months. And it also is supposed to guide how caseworkers plan and make decisions. So there's just some of, a few things. And then, so just to give kind of a quick overview, an investigation is made, when a referral goes into children's services. Now, the majority of referrals and, this information, I was able to find in the Alberta Incident of Child Abuse and Neglect Report, or AIS. So that is a study that is designed to collect information about children and families who are investigated by child welfare services on a periodic basis. So if you're like a nerd like me with research, it's really interesting and fascinating, that it, looks at its standardized set of definitions from every jurisdiction in Alberta. And it looks at, what are primary caregiver, risk factors, ages of children, household income, family dynamics.
Wow.
And yeah, so the last one was done in 2008, but there was one that was done in 2014, but it has not been released yet. I haven't been able to find it. If someone listens to this podcast and they know where it is, send it my way. So they do this in other provinces. So actually Ontario, they had one that was done in 2018, right?
Oh.
So in Ontario, they're usually way ahead, that they're kind of the standard of child welfare work when you're going back at child welfare, history in Canada. So basically, right, according to that data, the majority of referrals actually come from police and schools. Those are the two main ones, right? Obviously, it has on there like health professionals, just maybe daycare agencies and other agencies. But the two main ones are police, and obviously, if there is a domestic dispute and police go to the home, if there are children in the home, they have to call children's services, right? And then with schools, if a child discloses, they have to call children's services. So it could be something, and this has happened, where maybe a teacher overhears a child maybe say, I got an F on my test, so my mom's gonna beat the shit out of me. Sorry, I don't know if I'm able to.
No, that's go right ahead.
Add words, right?
That's exactly how the kid would probably say it. So
exactly. Yeah. So, and if you kind of think about, like, I grew up African, right? So I grew up African, but I'm Zimbabwean. I am African, and yeah, like growing up, spanking that was a form of discipline. But is that necessarily abuse, right? Because there's obviously the criminal outlining, in Canada of what you can use, in terms of physical discipline, like no, weapons, so like a belt, like just open palm, and it's, but really across the board, don't spank your kids, right? But if maybe you have an immigrant family that just immigrated to Canada, right? And so Children's Services is called. This whole investigation is, open, and what implications that can be if they don't understand, the system and the importance of having that cultural analysis. Or it could be, again, just that a teacher, maybe you have a child that, I don't know, who knows what's going on at home. It could be, parent is struggling with mental health, lost job, domestic violence. So maybe they're coming to school without their lunch, or they're not bathed, or they have dirty clothes, right? So, I mean, the teacher could take the time and I know teachers, not to criticize teachers, you guys do amazing work, but they don't always have, maybe the time to really kind of call the parent up and say, what's going on. And, if we're, talking about that racial analysis, like, which parent do you think maybe some teachers are more likely to call, maybe if they see white kid, Billy, maybe they're gonna call mom and say, hey, I noticed Billy hasn't been, what's going on, or their behavioral problems, versus maybe an Indigenous or Black child, right? It's like, what assumptions are made about parenting and families based on one's race. So once that investigation, that referral comes in, Children's Services mandated to investigate all referrals that come in, right? And so they're able to interview your friends, your family, teachers, doctors, anyone, to determine, right? And imagine how intrusive that is. How many, skeletons we all have in our closets in terms of our habits, our various habits, as somebody, was coming in and asking all those questions, and they're allowed to do that, right? And so Children's Services don't actually, going back to that innocent until proven guilty, they don't need proof that a child has been, for example, neglected, right? So if there's reasonable and probable grounds that a child is at risk, of future harm, there's grounds to intervene. And if the investigator determines that the child is at immediate risk, they can apprehend without notice, right?
Wow. Yeah.
So, and when apprehensions happen, there's always police presence, So I've had clients who have had
Yeah.
6 cops showing up for an apprehension,
Wow.
you know? So you can imagine for, you know, um, Black, Indigenous communities of color that have been, you know, brutalized at the hands of, you know, and pressed by the police force, how intrusive that is and how traumatizing that is for the parents and the family, and where, you know, that distrust begins, where then the organization or the system that has taken your kids in that way, now you have to work with someone. You know, they families don't end up working with an investigator. So if a file has to be open, it's then taken to a caseworker, right?
Mm-hmm.
But how then are you able to then try and start establishing that trust? Because it's like this person is part of the system, and that person then determines, you know, what act, when they can see their kids, how often, because, you know, when it goes to court, the court order is very open. So in terms of, for example, with our parenting coordination, supervised visits, when you know, in family law, when two parents separate, there's a parenting order, right? That determines like parenting time, like, okay, the child is with dad from Friday to Sunday, you know, for this many hours. And, you know, with a good lawyer and everything, obviously a parent can request certain things, right? And really like have the lawyers advocate and push to have like a minimum. But with child welfare, on the court order, it says access is at the discretion of the caseworker. So there's no minimum, right? So, I mean, maybe the caseworker could say, starting out, you're only seeing your kid 2 times a week for 4 hours.
Wow. How does that caseworker kind of determine that? Or is there like a matrix that they have to use, or not really?
We don't know. There's a lot of inner, you know, obviously internal policies and ways decisions are made. Because like I say, the SFYEA is, you know, some of those guidelines, and there is a policy book that is available online. And obviously Melanie has a lot of insight, right? She was a team lead. And a lot of times, no, it is not, you know, spelled out, right? So it depends on really the office, the manager, because it's, you know, you have the office, you have the director of obviously that office, and you have managers and team leads, and then caseworkers, investigators. And so that's where we see inconsistencies, because we have client files from offices all over Calgary, right? There's, you know, South Office, 14th Street, Native Services, that is right downtown. There's Forest Lawn and McKnight out in the Northeast. There's Hunterhorn and Bowness. So Airdrie. So depending on the office, you don't know. So sometimes you have, you know, and they're really great caseworkers that are awesome. They're trauma informed and strength based. And like when I work with them, it's great. You know, we're really like, things are happening. But then you have some of those offices where, yeah, and maybe, you know, maybe the caseworker is great, but maybe the team lead, you know, you don't know. So maybe you have at the South office, you have a parent that it's okay to smoke weed, you know?
Yeah.
Then you have another office where it's like, no, they get, you know, that's off the table, right? You have maybe 2 clients where they've experienced domestic violence, but maybe one case file, they're, you know, have that, they're working from that domestic violence perspective. You have another file where, you know, the individual is then re-traumatized, you know, because they're being threatened and saying, you know, if you talk to your partner, you know, you're never getting your child back, or not really acknowledging the trauma and how, you know, maybe the individual and the mom has kept their children safe, right? But, you know, sometimes it does happen a lot, you know, that a mom, if she has experienced violence and maybe she's struggling with addictions and mental health, she's going to lose her kids, right? So yeah, there's no guideline on some of the things on how that access is determined. And so when you link back to, I'm going to go back to kind of my role that I was doing with the advocacy work when I initially started, where as a parent advocate, that's why our work is so necessary and important. Because on one end, they get a legal aid lawyer, and obviously there's overload with caseloads and things like that, so they're not always, they're lawyers, right? So they're not trained to be able to work with someone that is dealing with trauma and addictions and all that. So what we do is we're able to then sit down and say, do you understand why children's services is involved, right? What has your caseworker told you need to do in order to get your kids back? Is it clear? Because sometimes it's not clear, right? Do you need to do counseling? Do you need to go to treatment? And obviously there's wait lists, right? I'm like, COVID, I'm like, just seeing those impacts. Like, I have a client of mine who has not been able to get into treatment, and she's supposed to do a 3-month program. She's finally going to start in June.
Wow.
But then there are those legislative timelines that say the maximum time that a child can be in care before they have to go for a PGO. So like permanent guardianship order, where their parental rights are terminated.
Wow.
Right? So I'm really curious to see how, the children's services is planning on addressing COVID, and how there are people that should have been in certain programs and counseling, and that has been, delayed. Obviously, there's some programs that are offered virtually, right? But seeing how that goes. So, you're having where parents are dealing with those strict legislative timelines. They're dealing with their own trauma, and they're dealing with their grief of being separated to their kids. I had a client tell me, it's like, they were having longer visits with their kids. So they're having like 6 hours. And they're like, I give my child a bath, put them in their big pajamas, and then I have to send them off to go back to their foster home. And she's like, I'm grieving.
Yeah.
And as a parent, I know that if my child was apprehended, I probably would not, I'd be angry all the time. It'd be hard for me to sit across from a caseworker and try and figure out what's going on. And then, so when you have parents in meetings that are at times, dysregulated, or they become triggered and they're upset, again, remember I said when a child is apprehended, there's a court process. So literally everything that a parent or guardian says and does is being written down, and it can be used in court. Right? And if
when you're under trauma, and there's so much to unpack with all of this, whether it be our history as a country with apprehension of children. Like, I think about someone who knows the history of their grandparent or family members that have been taken away, whether it be through residential schools or through the 60s scoop, or as you mentioned, the cultural barriers that we face. Alberta is a huge importee of people from all around the world, and with that comes different cultural backgrounds, different cultural norms that may not come across as understandable by some here, or I can see how so much of this can compile, and then if you are someone who is experienced so much of these things outside of this system, just to have more added on with this system, it's like another system of compiling concerns and the trauma that comes with that. Like my son is a cancer survivor, and I know the trauma we have from that, and that is just one little thing in our life. I can't imagine trauma after trauma after trauma after trauma, and the PTSD that you gain from that, and domestic violence, and like, it's just so many things that can compile, and then you have to watch what you say, and you have to watch what you do. My heart goes out to so many of the people that have to navigate the system in a tough time.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I mean, the fact is, and again, going back to that, the AIS study, the primary caregiver risk factors is victim of domestic violence, of individuals that are involved with children's services. And then next up is, little or no supports. And then mental health and addiction, so alcohol and drug abuse. Now, given those risk factors, then you add the fact that if that parent or guardian is Indigenous, if they're Black, if they're a person of color, recent immigrant, if they're low income and from a single-headed household, which, as we know, obviously being on the podcast that I'm on, poverty is gendered, it's racialized. Yeah. And, all those things then compiled make them more vulnerable for coming in contact with children's services and challenges like navigating the system. It's almost like a checklist. Yeah. So, okay, you're Black, domestic violence, so you've exposed your kids to domestic violence, failure to protect, emotional injury, struggling with mental health. You don't really have a lot of family in the city or healthy supports that can help you when you need a break. You're on age. Maybe you've moved houses a few times in the last year. Your kids are having behavioral problems. Maybe there's some, mental health challenges, right? And then you go to, maybe you're at the store or something, or your neighbor sees something and they call into children's services, right? Mm-hmm. Girl goes in. And I think that really kind of, as we were talking about in the beginning, that brings me to anti-Black racism here, in Canada. And I like that you did name, the Canadian, men and women that have been impacted by police violence here in Canada. Those names, and like Andrew Loku and Regis, Paquette right now, and she's Afro-Indigenous in Toronto. That's a pending investigation. And I've been seeing that, Canadian journalists have been hesitant to talk about anti-Black racism in Canada. They just want to focus on the US.
Yeah.
Yeah. And kind of create this narrative. And, there's a book, and I know I sent it to you to add to your resources that I recently bought. And it's Robin Menyard's book called Policing Black Lives, State Violence in Canada from Slavery to Present. And I've lived in the US, I'm from Zimbabwe, as I said, so I immigrated to the US in 97. I didn't move to Canada till 2007. So I'm going to be 34 this year. So I went to, elementary, high school there. And so I know what it's like in both places. And we're not like the US, we're different, but we still have a problem, and Canada has its own long history of institutionalized and systematic anti-Black racist policies and practices. Mm-hmm. And being that, I'm Zimbabwean and coming to Canada in 2007, I have had to do my own learning about Canadian history. I'm still learning. I have clients obviously that are Indigenous, that are First Nations. And so I have to educate myself on how I can better support them. So even though I'm Black, and I belong to a group that, is, marginalized, I'm in a position of privilege, right? When I'm working with my Indigenous clients, right? I'm sitting on the other end of the table. I have the education, I don't have to worry about my kid being, taken from me. Like, I have anxiety. We talked about the anxiety I had coming into this meeting, mm-hmm. And it's only maybe a few years ago that I actually started going to therapy. Earlier this year, I started medication, and my parents live in the city. I have a great partner because, when I was doing my social work degree, I was actually 12 weeks pregnant, and then I started
wow.
in 2017, yeah. And I gave birth March 30th, 2017, and I went back to school in May. So I was doing my program while I was on mat leave with a newborn. I really don't.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's the hardest thing I've ever had to do. It was so hard. I wanted to give up, but yeah. My parents do work, obviously, but I could, say, hey, can I drop her off for a few hours so I can study? And I told you my husband travels for work sometimes, so he's gone during the week. And on the weekend, I can drop her off. If my anxiety, if I'm struggling with that, I had that help. I could take a break, right? And I didn't have to worry about my mental health being used to assess whether I'm capable of parenting my daughter.
Mhm.
So, and that really informs the work that I do. And so, I didn't learn about residential schools or the 60s scoop or missing and murdered Indigenous women until I took a women's studies class at Mount Royal. I also had to
Well,
learn.
I can tell you, we grew up in Canada and we also did not
Well,
learn
that's
those
what I'm
things.
learning. That's what I've learned.
Yeah.
That's what I've learned. Like people don't acknowledge that. And so, and it's wild to me, right?
The last residential school in Canada was not far from where I grew up in, and I didn't know it existed. And it closed in 1996.
Yeah. I mean, that's appalling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that it makes, it's appalling, right? And I also just, recently have learned as well about like Black Canadian history and Black Nova Scotians.
Mm-hmm.
And
Another
Africa.
thing I did not know about.
Yeah. All I knew
Mhm.
about Canada, honestly, before I moved to the States is like I thought people lived in igloos. Like I didn't know there were provinces. I'm serious.
Yeah.
I mean, when you're in America, it's so like you think America is everything and it's like the
Yeah.
greatest place on earth and nothing else exists. I think maybe I knew there was Toronto, but Alberta, like I didn't know anything, right? So like again, I'm still doing that learning to educate myself, right? I don't put it upon, Black Canadians or my Indigenous clients to like teach me, right?
Yeah.
Like
Mhm.
really like as a social worker, I'm very humble in the way I approach my work. And I'm like, what do you need? And I'm like, if I mess up, like let me know. Like if I say
Mhm.
something that's off, I'm here to really like advocate and push. But so I'm doing that learning. And so in this book, and I really recommend you guys read it, like I'm still working through it, right? But
Mhm.
she covers everything from slavery and segregation in Canada. And many people, including myself, I didn't even know there were segregated schools in Canada. The
Mhm.
last one actually closed in 1983 in Nova Scotia, right?
Wow.
So most people just know Underground Railroad,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and they don't know anything, but so she continues on and she covers, anti-Blackness and law enforcement, the correction system, the overrepresentation of Black people in prisons in Canada,
Yes.
right?
Right.
And anti-Blackness in the education system. You
Mhm.
know, like I follow it sometimes in Toronto, everything that's happening with that, and even in Edmonton, there have been some issues that happened, with a mom and her young son and a do-rag, and
Oh yeah, that's right.
yeah,
That's Alberta, everybody.
exactly,
That's
Yeah.
Alberta.
exactly.
Yeah.
So
It's
and
funny how we forget these things. Like that
exactly,
was not that long ago.
Mhm.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
But so much has happened since that this type of thing gets lost in the mix of everything. And but we can't. It still happened.
No,
Mhm.
that's
No.
true. That's true. And I think like reading that book, what the author basically, has said is that this kind of erasure of anti-Black racism has been intentional, right?
Mhm.
And it's done on purpose. And that, in Canada, unlike the US, and I'm reading this from her book actually, she says, the systemic collection of publicly available race-based data is rare at the federal, provincial, and municipal levels.
Mhm.
So even in my role right now as, child welfare advocacy and recently just doing more program management and development, I also have Googled like Black children in care in Alberta.
Yeah.
I haven't been able to find anything. Again, if I'm wrong and someone knows where this stuff is, let me know. But Ontario obviously is doing that work. They're doing the race-based analysis. I've been really inspired by the One Voice, One Vision project in Ontario, where they really have done the research and work to cater, child welfare toolkits for, Afro Canadians because they're overrepresented in Toronto. And there's the Black Nova Scotian social workers that advocate for Black children to be placed in Black foster homes. So, and I know you guys are research nerds, right? And it's like without data, it's
Yeah.
hard
Yep.
assess where the
We
gap.
are very big on data.
Yes. Yeah. Like I'm, Kian and Melanie get annoyed with me because I'm like, guys, we need to evaluate, we need data, we need to collect this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what does this mean? Where do we need to change? Those, in terms of those evidence-based approaches that are one of our values. So it's like, if there's no data, if we are not able to address issues, it can create this false sense that there's no problem.
Yeah.
Right? Like US has the problem, we don't have the problem. And when I was reading through the AIS report, it does make the distinction between Indigenous. So it breaks it down to First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and then non-Indigenous. Yeah. So non-Indigenous is white, Caribbean, African, Filipino, we don't know.
Yeah.
And that's in Alberta. So I don't know how many Black children are in care.
Right.
Compared to the overall, obviously, like population of
right. So you don't know the percentage of the children versus the population, for example.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that is all, like, obviously, as Robin put it, it creates this multicultural, racially harmonious utopia that Canada is, and it's a narrative that immigrants buy into. It's something I bought into when I came here, right? And again, that's why I'm so passionate about child welfare advocacy and the work that I do, because I know how hard it is to be a parent. It is the hardest thing that I'm going through, and it's emotionally and mentally draining. Like I said, I'm in therapy, where I'm trying to work out my own trauma so I don't project that on my child, right? I utilize Kian to understand child development and what is an age appropriate conversation, like what's okay to talk to a 3-year-old versus an 8-year-old. And these are all things that parents that are involved with children's services, they're assessed on this. They essentially have to be perfect parents. And when we think about policing, as Robin says, and the overrepresentation of Indigenous, First Nations, Black children in Canada's child welfare system, it's not accidental. They're the most policed, they're the most surveilled. And, Alicia, when you talked about those gendered spaces, right, and environments, in schools, in communities, there are certain communities that have more cops than, does the homes in Elbow Drive and Lower Mount Royal, do they have as much cop presence, right? If you have, a Black mom, like I say sometimes, I'm like, I know I can go out looking a hot mess and no one is going to question, my parenting, right? But maybe there's a mom who's First Nations, right? When she's in the doctor's office and she's tied her babies and crying, what assumptions are made about her and her parenting based on her appearance and based because she's Indigenous?
Exactly. That's a really good point. And thanks for raising it. And there's one other resource that I'd just like to bring our listeners' attention to too is, well, Alicia and I have talked in previous episodes about this tool government uses called GBA Plus, Gender-Based Analysis Plus, but there's a really good tool that the city of Seattle has created, and it's a racial equity lens and a racial equity toolkit. Now, I don't know how well they've been implementing it. And I haven't seen any evaluations of it, but on surface level, like, it's a good resource to look to as maybe as a potential starting point for government to kind of understand, like, how do you start integrating these considerations into your work. But
so, and there's actually a video that just came to my attention yesterday. It is Calgarian. And it's from a group called Canadian Cultural Mosaic Foundation. And they actually did a film, Calgary-centric, on racism. I believe it was in 2017. So we're already looking at, it's like almost 3 years.
I actually may have seen that, I think.
But it's really great because it talks to many Calgarians about what they face every day, just within society. It also talks to quite a few experts. One of the more interesting things that I got out of it was this mosaic that we talk about, this multiculturalism that we're so proud of. There's a reason why we have it, and a lot of it has been throughout the generations. We bring people here for their labor. That's why they come here. So we have this long history of exploiting the labor of immigrant people, and whether that started with our Asian brothers and sisters with the railway, to Ukrainian immigrants, to obviously, gosh, like look at, we were going to talk a little bit about COVID today with childcare, but it even ties into the fact that COVID's hit so many racialized people harder than others. And a lot of those people work in the low paying jobs that we specifically brought them here for their labor, whether that be meat packing or personal care workers. And you think about being at a new country where you are working ridiculously hard with very low pay, and a lot of that pay is going back to a country that you might be from, right? Now add the dimension of family on top of that, right? With two parents working. A lot of the volunteering I do within the STEM community is with underserved kids. And I can tell you, like, their parents are some of the hardest working people I've ever met, with the multiple jobs. And even the kids that I work with, they've already got part-time jobs by the time they're, early teens and entrepreneurs and trying to make things ends meet in Canada. So all of these dimensions go on top of what we're talking about here and are just more ticks on the boxes that you're mentioning. Right. And I know we wanted to talk a little bit about COVID today, and maybe how you've mentioned it a little bit already about how some parents can't get the training that they need. What are some other components that you're noticing, whether it be the school system, like the fact that sometimes the children are noticed in the school system, that's not there anymore. We know the domestic violence is increasing due to pressures. How has that affected some of the work that you've been doing?
I mean, it's so much. I think we're still gonna see the long-term effects of COVID, because I had some child welfare clients that were supposed to have trials, right, to kind of determine if that permanent guardianship is going to be either terminated or their kids are going to be returned, in different hearings, and they're trials that obviously the court system is backed up, so
the courts aren't even running, I don't think, right?
And even before COVID, right?
They're backed up before.
They always seem to be backed up. I think some are operating virtually, but I don't.
They are doing virtual stuff, but I mean, if you're trying to book a trial, right, before COVID, it was like 8 months. It's not like you can just book a trial and it's in 3 months. It could be 6 to 8 months. So that's how backed up it was before COVID. And now imagine, after COVID, and, with Melanie's parenting coordination, it's great that she's been able to do things virtually, because obviously you have parents trying to, negotiate, juggle, some of those roles.
That's if they have digital means of doing that.
Right?
Sure.
Yeah, exactly. With co-parenting, you definitely have, in terms of like the family law aspect, I don't do that as much. It's more Kayan and Melanie, but obviously we still consult that. You have some people wanting to parents that are co-parenting that are withholding access. So maybe, me and my husband is separated, and I'm like, I know you're supposed to have, tonight on the weekend, but I don't think you're following, COVID rules. Like, I think you're having people over, so I'm not dropping her off.
Right.
And you can't just go to court to then address that, right?
Right.
So, and then there are people that were paying maybe child support a certain amount, and now they're not working. And so what that means, like, there's just so many, different aspects. And you're right, in terms of, individuals that, are experiencing violence at home, right, and having to be social distancing and self-isolating, and not being able to access, certain services, right? I'm trying for us to be part of the Calgary Domestic Violence Collective, because a lot of the work that we do, with families, domestic violence is at the center of that work. And so I've sat in on different webinars to just keep up to date on how the domestic violence organizations that do that work full time, like how they're trying to address and support parents. And I think, when it comes to like COVID and parenting, like, we have our Instagram page. So Kayan, she's been posting some really great resources. So definitely people can go on there, where she posts like different activities that you can do with kids. She's helped me, my daughter was in her day home 3 days a week. And now when daycare opened up, she's in daycare, but she was like, if you're doing learning, so instead of, it doesn't have to be sit down at a table, be structured, take your kids out on a walk, right? Like if you have a toddler and be like, what color are the trees? How many rock, like if you're doing numbers, like pick up 4 rocks, like, make just, and you're getting exercise, you're getting fresh air, so she gives those tools and really trying to assess, she said it's not about work-life balance right now, it's about work-life integration, right? So just seeing like, what does life look like now? Have some kind of routine. It may not be what it used to be. Don't have those high expectations on yourself, because I think a lot of times, we as women, as mothers, we have these high expectations on ourselves. And one of my favorite books is by Dr. Shafali, the Conscious Parenting. I refer to it a lot. It really challenges, the type of, the way I want to parent. But, she has a quote that says, often it's the adjustment of our expectations rather than the reality itself. That's the hurdle that we have to leap. So it's like with COVID, you're not going to be as productive as you were before COVID, and unfortunately, like I'm blessed that I work at an organization that allows me that flexibility. Like I will sleep in and I will set my meetings in the afternoon because I'm not a morning person, and I just set my schedule because sometimes it's hard, it's exhausting with COVID and seeing the constant news cycle, but I know other people don't have that privilege to where they can be flexible with their work. Right? They're kind of like, they have to log in, it's 9:30, they're logged on, and they're then doing homeschooling. I don't have to homeschool my kids, right? So really just be easy on yourself. And, I'm sure most kids are having more screen time. It's not the end of the world. Can't say they're not going to be developmentally, challenged or anything like that, right? So, no, it's a tough time. Just lower those expectations, and try and, reassess, in terms of the roles at home, obviously, like, how we can take turns, like how we can do this, because we're both working, we're both having to parent. And I know obviously not every parent has that privilege to be able to kind of speak up and say, I need help, and I need more. But, there are a lot of online resources. There's Distress Center and different resources that, individuals can try and safely access, to be able to get that support.
Well, thank you for all that. And you're answering a good chunk of our questions, which is good.
I'm like, I get passionate and then I start talking and then circle back and
it's all good.
So. Well, thank you so much for all this advice and for being so open and sharing your expertise with us.
No, thank you.
So I'm not sure on our timing, Marcy, but I think we've probably close to hitting our we can talk for a very long time yet, I have no doubt. But was there anything else that you wanted to make sure our listeners knew, or any other resources that you want to make sure that you mention? And anything you mentioned, you can send it to us, we'll put into the resource section.
No, I mean, I think I sent you guys some stuff, but I mean, to follow us, like, we're off, do a lot of free, resources. I know next week Kiana's planning on doing a like a series on, how to talk to kids about race and racism, and looking at the different.
Awesome.
That's great.
Right? Because the way that you're going to talk about that with a 3-year-old, is going to be different than a 10-year-old or a teenager, and looking at like mental health with some of that, and especially for white parents. I know they're like, well, what do I say? I was actually at Co-op one day and just shopping, and there was I think like a 4-year-old, cute little white kid with his parents, and he's like looking at me, and I mean, I knew what was coming, right? And he looks at me and he's like, Mommy, she's brown, look at that brown lady, and I was like, yeah, hi. And the parents' faces were bright. And they were so embarrassed. I'm like, no, 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 you don't say that. You know, she's just a nice lady. And I'm like, no, but I'm brown. You know, he's 4. He's like, you know, and I'm like, it's okay, right? Like, it's not, you know, that idea of like color, but like, that's not the right approach. And I'm like, he's 4. He's not had those like adult projections of like what race is and it's a construct and all that. It's, you know, it's just simple. Well, mommy's skin is white, and, you know, this lady's skin is brown, right? And even my daughter is 3, so, you know, my sister's husband is white, right? And so recently she's like, you know, mommy, she loves Brown Skin Girl by, you know, by Beyonce, and she's like, mommy, you know, I'm a brown skin girl, you know. And I was like, yeah, you're a brown skin girl. And she's like, Auntie Sharon is a brown skin girl. And I'm like, yeah, she is. And she's like, what about Uncle John, you know, because that's his name. And I was like, well, what color is his skin? And she's like, it's white, you know. And then that was it, and she was happy and she moved along, like.
Yeah.
And so, and that's, you know, that's when it starts. Like, she's 3, so she's curious, she's starting to know people's skin, you know, is different, and that's okay. But I think, you know, it should not just be a responsibility of, you know, Black parents, you know, Indigenous parents, you know, people of color, to have, for us to have to educate our kids about, you know, this is how you can stay safe, and like, you know, hands up and don't cause problems and behave this way. And, you know, I think really what I would like to see kind of going forward, given the climate that we're in, especially in Canada, that it's really time for white parents, you know, to kind of really do that work and talk to their kids about race, you know. And Google, there's YouTube, there's Google,
Yeah.
there's so much free information. There's like library cards are free, right? To kind of do that work. And I don't mind questions, but I don't want a question when you actually haven't done the work, right? Like, read something and then say, you know what, I don't really like, what does that really mean when it's like race is a construct, right? Like, then kind of engage in that. And no one is perfect. Like, I think people are afraid to make mistakes or say the wrong thing. If you say the wrong thing, then say, hey, you know what, I messed up, I say the wrong thing, right? I'm new to this, I'm still learning a lot. I say that to clients. I say that, you know, I don't know, maybe I did say something wrong in this whole presentation. And so you got to take ego out of it, right? It's not about you. It's not, you know. I think, yeah, that's all I can really. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah.
Thank you. I thank you for that. And I know that as a scientist myself, I you know, you learn about science and you go to school and you learn a certain way. And I remember when I went back to school to do my master's in the social sciences, I took a class called the philosophy of science, and there were times in that class where I literally, like, my mind just went right, like, the fact that so much of what we do is a social construct, right? Like, there's so much of our society that, of course, we can change it. We built it.
Yeah.
So if we built it, we can unbuild it, right? Like, just because it's the way things have always been, it doesn't mean it has to be the way it is. And getting my mind out of that very scientist facts, you realize, well, even a lot of the science we've done has been built on social constructs. So you have to take the context of the data and unpack it a little bit and see where if we've created structures in our society that the base is wrong, then the structure's wrong. And that it's okay to say it's wrong and that we have to restructure it or change it. But that's one of the things I try to teach people is, like, what is a social construct? And if it is a social construct, it can be unconstructed or changed or reconstructed, right? So I think that's a big takeaway to remind everybody to, one, learn what that term is. Know when it's what is a social construct, and from there we can change that. Like, even the concept of Blackness and whiteness, in Canada, we have a history of making certain things, like, what is white, right? But early on, Ukrainian Canadians were not white, right? Like, we change what is white, which means it doesn't need to even be there. If we can change it, it doesn't need to exist in the realms of discriminating and putting barriers on people, because we have changed that concept for as long as we've been here.
Yeah.
You know,
You're so right. Yeah.
So it's yeah, we all have lots to learn, and thank you so much for taking the time to discuss with us and our listeners in a challenging time, and to tie that into how this affects the kids and the social systems that pertain to so many families that are struggling there. So thank you so much for this discussion today.
Yeah, no, thank you guys. I had a lot of nerves. I was texting my husband, my sister, and my mom, and they're like, positive affirmations, like and
Yeah.
you guys have, thank you for really just creating this like space where, I can just, speak openly and, with emotions running high, and for us to just engage in this, like, I definitely really appreciate that. And, I'm looking forward to having more conversations and working with you, Marcy, because we're trying to expand as an organization and continue to do the child welfare advocacy work that we do. We want to just make sure we're doing it right. So kind of making those connections and collaborating, even with your work with gendered spaces, Alicia, as we kind of build our organization, we criticize these systems, and I want to just make sure that as we're creating and growing, that we're not recreating those like oppressive systems, right? And then I think lastly, I know those guys will, if I don't say it, that obviously we offer parenting coordination, reach out to us, and just
Absolutely.
visits. We have a soft reopening as of June 1st. So kind of taking those measures in. So yeah, just we have an intake form online, and reach out to us if you're needing the services or for a consult, or you want to talk child welfare advocacy. Anyone who's listening, if they know any exciting work that's really happening, like out west out here, because there's a lot happening in Ontario, Nova Scotia, and all that. But yeah, reach out to me, please. I'll be excited to work with you. So yeah.
Well, thank you. So I've been frantically writing things down. So I've tried to find some key takeaways from our discussion today. And I do recommend that our listeners look up your group. And if you know of anybody who could use the support, to definitely to look up the group and to seek you out, because I think it's important work that you're doing. Now, some of the interesting things I thought that you mentioned today is it goes into the unconscious bias and the stereotyping that Marcy and I do. It's just that we all have them. And when it comes to the social services system, we have to check our stereotypes that we have of who would use this system. And instead of blaming parents, maybe try to understand some of the systems that they're in and some of the difficulties that they're in, to better understand some of the traumas they may have faced, and to remember that these are families that we are talking about here. There's children involved, but also a family unit involved, and we need to make sure we remember that always when discussing these topics. The importance of data. Data is important. Yeah. But not just data, but how and what we track, and also access to data. And sorry, what was the data from 2014 that you're trying to get your hands on, just so we can throw that out there again?
The AIS, so the Alberta Incident of Child Abuse and Neglect.
Perfect. So if anybody knows where that is, or we get our hands on that would be really great.
Yeah.
And then just to remind everybody that when it comes to any of these topics, that it is on us to do our homework, that we need to be the ones to learn. It is not up to those of a marginalized position to be teaching us in a privileged position, to remember what privilege is, and that all of us can have privilege in various forms or in different ways, and to understand the privilege that you do have, what you can do with it. And know that there's things you don't know, and that's okay. And sometimes it's okay to ask questions, but you have to come from a heart where you want to know and you want to learn, for sure. And just also in this current timing, that we have to adjust our expectations of ourselves, of our children, especially since we're all together a lot now. and maybe put at the door some of our high expectations of ourselves and know that this is a challenging time. We'd like to remind everybody, this is a world pandemic. It's not a Alberta pandemic or Calgary pandemic. This is a world pandemic, and to try to put yourself in that and understand that it's okay to not know what to do or how to do it sometimes. There's lots of resources out there. We'll put some on here for everybody, but just, adjust your expectations. And it's okay to have good days. It's okay to have bad days.
Yeah.
It's okay to seek help. So
Yeah.
So those were my takeaways. I hope I grabbed everything
Yeah.
that's of importance. So thank you again for that.
Yeah. And I would just add that, these issues that we've been talking about today are complex and, multidisciplinary, and they can seem, overwhelming because they're so huge. But just to build upon the earlier points that, these were constructed by humans and they can be dismantled by humans. And just to acknowledge even that our systems are broken and our systems are biased, it seems obvious because, at the time when they were built and how they're being maintained, I mean, we live in a society that's still largely, racist and patriarchal and sexist. So of course there's biases with them, right? And there's issues.
Well, and if those are the things that like I said, we created our structure on, it goes right through the system. Sorry, I'm going to mention, there was something Seth Meyers mentioned this week about how there's this connection about bad apples. Oh, there's just a few bad apples, right? And how, if you were going to an orchard and you were going to go pick some apples and the owner of the orchard said, well, there's a few bad apples out there. And you said, well, how bad? Well, kill you bad. He'd be like, there's something wrong with this orchard, right? Like the bad apples or the bad examples or the bad systems are structured from somewhere. And we can't just say, oh, it's just a few bad apples or a few bad examples. No, we have to look at the whole system and we have to see how those apples were grown.
The root causes, the roots of the apple tree.
Look at that. I like the
And I guarantee you that he had very good writers of a multi-dimensional and multicultural background that helped him write that. He did not do that himself.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Rebecca. And just to remind our listeners, don't forget to check out the resources section of the podcast to find the references and different resources for you to learn. And once again, you can find our podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, and Buzzsprout. Please hit subscribe to be notified when a new episode is released. And we would love it if you could leave us a rating or a review.
And let's continue the conversation. Let us know what you think. You can ask us some questions. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And also we're on LinkedIn. And we'd love to hear from you. And if there's an episode that you would like to see that we should cover, please always reach out to us. We'd love to talk to you. And if you want to be a guest on our show, we can definitely discuss that. And you can also find Positive Choices Consulting on social media. So where can they find you?
So we're on social media, Instagram and Twitter. We're on LinkedIn as well as Facebook. So
perfect. We'll find those links and make sure they get in our resource
I'll send them your way.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much for the discussion today. And
thank you, ladies.
Until next time. Bye.
All right.
Thank you so much.